I imagine many of you have heard that speech before, and maybe some of you haven't. And it's the mission of this group to get more Americans to hear it because it's so powerful and it's so relevant today. Now I'd like to once again just briefly introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Glenn Diesen. Glenn is a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia in Global Affairs. Professor Diesen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I couldn't agree more. I think this speech by JFK is incredibly important. And the fact that this kind of talk is so distant from what we're hearing these days makes it all the more important. And I would say that the message and speech of President Kennedy was really great importance because not only did the message of peace encourage the Americans and their European allies to humanize their adversary as a necessity to avoid war and pursue peaceful solutions. But very importantly, the message was also received in Moscow by Khrushchev, who then saw a friendly face and opportunity to overcome the military rivalry and pursue peace, proving, as he said, that war is not unavoidable. And I think that the peace he was pursuing very clearly was not naive. He recognized the security competition among the great powers, but the important recipe for how to deal with security competition is you want to have deterrence, but without provoking the other side. This is really the key recipe for any stable peace. And over time, you have the possibility or prospect to develop trust as well. So JFK pointed out that a message of peace should not be controversial or difficult to make. What indeed should be difficult to make is the message of war. However, today, peace has nonetheless become taboo across the West, especially in our current proxy war against the Russians. And we have effectively criminalized diplomacy and negotiations, which is the condition for peace. So I will give you an example from Europe, what is going on this side of the pond, as the European Union has always considered itself a peace project. And whenever there has been a conflict around the world, the European Union always advocates for the same solution, which is to revive diplomacy and negotiations, end the bloodshed as soon as possible, and start talking. One doesn't have to agree on everything, but at least one has to start talking. This has always been the recipe, but until war came to Europe. Now it's not anymore. In the current conflict we have with Russia, the EU now openly rejects diplomacy and negotiations as has chosen war as the only path to peace. Again, Hungary, who now holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, recently made a visit to Ukraine and Russia to explore this possibility for restarting diplomacy and even negotiating an end to the war. However, the EU condemned it. They said our objective should be to isolate Russia and not give it legitimacy by talking to them. So Hungary is now even being punished by the European Union for its diplomatic peace mission. And the EU consensus, which is now coerced, is to reject any diplomacy. That is, we don't talk to the opponent. And our media has equally become very complicit. Our newspapers covering it tend to leave out that the Hungarian prime minister went to both Russia and Ukraine, and instead they tend to focus on his trip to Russia only in order to smear him as a stooge of President Putin. So this is the narrative-driven media, and what they're pushing is always conflict. Now, the incoming foreign policy chief of the European Union, Kallas, she recently argued very explicitly against diplomacy because, in her words, Putin is a war criminal and we should not legitimize war criminals by speaking to them. So the solution, what is the solution to peace? Well, it's not talking to your adversaries. And for God's sake, don't try to understand them either. Diplomacy instead is to sit in a room with people you already agree with and condemn the opponent for being evil and do not grant them any legitimacy. So one can ask then, how do they envision peace with Russia? Well, the outgoing foreign policy chief of the European Union doesn't envision any peace. He argues that the Ukraine war had to be solved on the battlefield. This is the foreign policy chief, while the incoming foreign policy chief has called for defeating Russia, which entails breaking the country up into smaller pieces. Now, one can always ask, how would we react if the Russians spoke in similar terms of our nations? So the same actually applies to NATO as well, our Cold War relic. The NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, which is our previous prime minister, he argues frequently that weapons are the path to peace. This is close to a copyright infringement of the dystopian message from George Orwell's 1984, in which war is peace. And across Europe, we see the Russian media censored, as we cannot understand, should not be able to be vulnerable to their arguments, as everything is now propaganda and should be censored. And even within Europe, journalists and academics in Europe who try to understand and explain the Russian position, to put themselves in the shoes of the Russians, are accused of being disloyal, they're intimidated, and have every reason to fear for their job. So not only is war peace, but ignorance is strength. And in short, this is clearly not the peace that JFK was speaking of. Nonetheless, whenever the political media leads push war and denounce diplomacy, they do not express any shame as warmongers, but instead they express virtue and self-righteousness. And one can ask why. And well, my answer is ideological conviction. They see this as being principled, pursuing a democratic peace, one which should not be corrupted by making any compromises with the evil adversaries. Now, I argue that ideology can have a devastating impact on peace. So when we speak of ideology, it tends to be a system of ideas, beliefs, and values to organize society. And this in itself does not have to be a bad thing. Indeed, our guiding ideologies will have many positive components. Liberalism, democracy, human rights, ideals which we should cherish as well as protect. However, what we often see is that this translates into a wider ideology by linking it to an entity of power, in which perpetual peace depends on promoting liberal democracy under the condition of Western hegemony. And herein lies, I argue, the danger of ideology, as the makeup of society is also renowned for being often used as a tool for power and control, and to justify divisions and conflict between groups. It can be used to mobilize the public against a dehumanized adversary. In short, ideologies, once you explain not the world as competing interests, but good versus evil values, then we represent the good values, adversaries represent the evil opposite. So no longer is there any real room for compromise. And we see that whenever we aim to take out an adversary, reality is often simplified and dumbed down. It is always done then in the name of freedom, democracy, or human rights. We see this with the crippling sanctions on Venezuela, invasion of Iraq, occupation of Syria, the destruction of Libya, the threats of a war against Iran, the current proxy war against Russia, and also the future war against China. Every time we see that liberal democratic values are often used to sideline international law. And this is the great contradiction of this, how liberalism as an ideology has been used. Because human rights and democratic mandates in the international system, it was intended to create a more peaceful system. Why? It would restrict or restrain the actions of governments by having to take into account human rights as well as respect the self-governance of other countries. But instead, we see it's now enabling coercion against other governments. So whenever we want to do some sanctions, coups, invasions, we always cite our values. And this is quite dangerous. And it's important to understand that for much of the world, when they hear us speak of democracy and human rights, they usually assume that we're already loading the bombs on our planes, as this has become now the association. And ideology is often based on, or at least they can manipulate some of the basic instincts in human nature. As human beings, we tend to organize the world into groups, as we're a social animal. And these groups are, us, which is the in-group, versus them, which is the out-group. And ideology tend to assign us these good values, while our adversaries are the exact opposite. And we can't comprehend then why our adversaries would be afraid of us. After all, we stand for freedom, while we refuse to recognize any legitimate security concerns of our adversaries because they stand for being against freedom. Now, there's a fascinating quote by President Reagan in I think it was 1987. Anyways, it was a few years after the Able Archer NATO military exercise, which almost triggered a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And this was Reagan coming to the recognition, in which he wrote, sorry, 3 years had taught me something surprising about the Russians. Many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy were genuinely afraid of America and Americans. I'd always felt from our deeds it must be clear to anyone that Americans were moral people who, starting at the birth of our nation, had always used our power as a force for good in the world. This is end quote. Now, it is remarkable that if you have two main powers stuck in a Cold War where each side feared the other one will annihilate them, that one would be surprised that the opponent would see you even as a threat. But this is often what ideology does to all of us. Now, obviously, in a world of competing security interests, what creates peace? Well, it's through mutual understanding and compromise. Again, the traditional understanding of how peace is created. However, in a world of good versus bad values, how can we resolve any conflicts? And I think this is also why we always refer to our adversaries as the new Hitler, because one cannot compromise with Hitler. Compromise and understanding and peace is merely appeasement. This is the word we always use. Instead, we're always living in the late 1930s, early 40s, and peace is instead created by defeating the adversary. Because, as we always learn, in a world of good versus evil values, compromise is appeasement, and we must instead destroy our opponents. This is a very different understanding of peace, one which JFK also warned against. But it's also a very good description of the dangerous mentality which we suffer of today. And whenever we have conflicts, our opponents are always labeled as such. And this mentality has taken us to where we are today, where NATO now declares that war is the path to peace, while also not just not doing diplomacy, but even punishing those who attempt to understand or even talk to the other side. So peace is our victory, our leadership, our hegemony to advance our values. Now, in his speech we just listened to, JFK argued for a just peace for everyone, not just for one side. And he reassured that America was not pursuing a peace based on Pax Americana, that is a peace based on US dominance. And when the Cold War came to an end and was declared to be over in Malta in 1989, for a brief period, we did speak in this language of JFK. There was talk of the Cold War having ended thanks to negotiations and compromise, which produced a common peace through common security, and we would together build a common Europe. This was the end of bloc politics, and we signed our pan-European security agreements as well. However, 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and everything changed very quickly. Only 1 month after the collapse of the Soviet Union, President Bush Sr. gave a speech at the State of the Union in January of 1992, very different from the Kennedy speech, in which he argued, and this quote, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War," and then citing wars from Korea to Vietnam as have been part of producing this peace. So suddenly the negotiations were not mentioned. The compromise and common peace was also gone. He also added that we are the United States of America. The leader of the West has become the leader of the world. And as long as I'm president, I will continue to lead in support of freedom everywhere. End quote. And this was, I would argue, the beginning of the narrative of Pax Americana. The former US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, who also contributed to negotiating an end to the Cold War, he warned that this created myth-making from the first day the Soviet Union collapsed. And he argued this was very dangerous, this new war narrative, because peace was no longer seen to have been the result of diplomacy and negotiations with the Russians, but instead peace was the result of having defeated the Russians. So what he considered to be, again, a very false and dangerous lesson of history, which meant that effectively the peace which JFK had advocated was dismissed and instead replaced with this Pax Americana, where any emergence of any rivals would demand their defeat in order for peace to be restored. And I would say that the result for Europe has also been devastating, because the commitment we made to creating what Gorbachev referred to as common European home, or inclusive pan-European security architecture with the Russians, were also abandoned, even though we signed these agreements in the early 90s. But instead of removing the dividing lines on our continent, which we committed to, they were instead gradually moved toward the Russian borders over the next 30 years by expanding NATO. Now, when the Russians complained about betraying the pledge of a common peace and a common Europe based on indivisible security, we instead accused them of attempting to undermine the democratic peace under NATO and American leadership. Now, this very predictably, I argue, revived the Cold War logic, simply because all security was now back to zero sum. As NATO expanded, we had to agree or find out where the new dividing lines would be, and new conflicts would be quite predictable in societies which were already quite divided. Now, for those who remember the debates in the 1990s, there were a lot of both American and European leaders, political, military, intelligence, who warned that this would be a terrible decision. Even Bill Clinton himself warned in '94 that if we expand NATO, we could redivide the continent and recreate confrontation. Secretary of Defense William Perry even considered to resign his position, and also confirmed everyone recognized this would recreate conflicts with the Russians, but it was okay because the Russians were weak, so they neglected it. At this point, one who I would consider to be, possibly the greatest American diplomat, George Kennan, was also an architect for the containment policies against the Soviet Union. He correctly predicted that this would start a new Cold War, exactly because it recreated the dynamic of the Cold War. He also argued that a hostile Russian reaction would be unavoidable, and then he also made the prediction that once that Russian reaction would come, we would attribute it to Russia's aggressive imperialist nature, as opposed to a reaction to our decision to betray the common European security architecture and instead expand NATO. Indeed, when Bush Jr. Pushed through the idea in 2008 to grant future membership to Ukraine, the Europeans were very hesitant and pushed back, but eventually folded. As Angela Merkel of Germany argued, this would be seen by the Russians as a declaration of war. And even up to 2020, the former British ambassador to Russia, he warned that pushing Ukraine into NATO, that this was the best way to start a war if this is really what we wanted. So we knew kind of what we were walking into. This was predicted. This is very, very predictable, even though it has gone down the memory hole. And but it begs the question, why was this done? And again, I would attribute much of it to ideology. The assumption was ideology, NATO expansion would create this democratic peace. We would have facilitate a Pax Americana, as JFK warned against, that is hegemony and advancement of liberal democratic values. Now, we can obviously put ourselves in the shoes of the Russians and ask ourselves, what if we would have been in the same situation? What if the Russians or the Chinese attempted to increase their own security by, for example, pulling in Mexico into a military alliance, then sending weapon systems, modernizing its ports, and preparing for war with the United States? We can ask, how would the United States react? But we don't discuss this. Instead, we artificially frame military expansion solely into the language of advancing liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Sorry. Now, I often make the argument in terms of the Ukraine war that NATO expansion caused this war. But while it's possible to challenge ideas with facts, it's often nearly impossible with ideologies, as this is how we have built up the ideas of our societies. Now, for more than a decade, I have argued that if we wanted to strengthen Ukraine's security and sovereignty, then we should assist Ukraine in diversifying its economic ties so it doesn't become too dependent on Russia. We should also overcome the Cold War legacy of exclusive military blocs by instead allowing it to be a bridge instead of a bastion. Now, the last thing I have always argued we should do was to threaten NATO expansion, as this could make Ukraine into a frontline state, as this would then make Russia feel compelled to intervene militarily, and this would likely result in the mass deaths of Ukrainians, the loss of territory, and possibly the destruction of their nation. And this, again, for me, was very, very predictable. And it's not even my main ideas. In 2008, this was written by the current US CIA director, William Burns, who wrote that any attempts to expand NATO into Ukraine would likely cause a civil war in Ukraine. And the Russian would also then militarily intervene. And he even added that the Russians would not want to do this, but they would feel compelled because they could not accept NATO in Ukraine, much like US would not be able to accept Russian military in Mexico. So for me, this argument is very easy to defend. I can cite numerous American and European leaders who predicted that NATO expansion would trigger a war, which won't say it anymore, of course, as we need the conformity. But if we cite them, we're told that this could legitimize the Russian invasion. So one cannot discuss this anymore. And I'm also told that our commitment to liberal democracy implies we can't give really Russia a veto of Ukrainian membership. But over the past 20 years, or over the 20 years that NATO attempted to pull Ukraine into NATO, every single poll between 92 and 2014 proved that only 20% of Ukrainians even wanted to join NATO during all those years which they were being pulled into NATO. Now, I'm also told that Russia's authoritarian, the West is democratic, so any push of Ukraine into the Western orbit is democratic, irrespective of what the Ukrainians would want. But we also see what happened after 2014. That is, Washington asserted extreme control over the Ukrainian state. We learned that from day one after the government was toppled, the CIA began to cooperate to build bases or secret bases along the Russian borders. The Ukrainian general prosecutor even argued that Washington was running Ukraine like a colony since 2014, and people from NATO countries even took key position in the new Ukrainian government. The political opposition media was purged with Western support, Russian culture, language, the Orthodox Church, all were given a minimal role because they were seen as linking Ukrainians to Russia. But this is also then portrayed as democratic, as the Ukrainians were allegedly liberated from centuries of Russian influence. So it's a very different way of looking at how we are pushing for the self-determination of Ukraine. Anyways, JFK made this point that peace is possible and war is not unavoidable. But this also demands that we take an opportunity to actually take yes for an answer and accept peace. But what we've seen over the past 30 years is we rejected every attempt of creating a durable peace with the Russians. First of all, for the first 25 years after the Cold War, between 1991 and 2014, Russia's main strategic objective was to integrate into inclusive European security architecture. That means no bloc politics, but instead we said no, we would create a Europe without them, which became a Europe against them. In 2013, both Russia and Ukraine proposed a trilateral agreement with the EU in order to prevent Ukraine from being a front line and instead being a bridge. The Europeans said no, you have to choose us or the Russians. The Ukrainians made the right choice, and we then began to destabilize and topple their government. Before we toppled the government, the Ukrainian government attempted to resolve the crisis by forming a unity government with the opposition. The Europeans accepted, they they signed it as guarantors, but then within the next 24 hours, we nonetheless toppled their government, and key top diplomats went to Kiev to give legitimacy to the coup instead of holding up our end of the deal. So we toppled the democratically elected government in Ukraine against the will of the majority of Ukrainians and also in violation of their constitution, and we called it a democratic revolution. When civil war predictably broke out, the Europeans negotiated, well, the French and the Germans negotiated the Minsk II peace agreement, but then spent the next 7 years undermining it. It was later admitted by both the Germans and the French that they were merely buying time to arm Ukraine, to create new realities on the ground. In 2019, Zelensky was then elected on a very powerful peace mandate with 73% of the vote. He ran on making peace with Donbass, Russia, by implementing the Minsk Accords, but he was then pressured to reverse his position as Western states-backed nationalists who called it appeasement and capitulation. And in the name of democracy, we contributed to reversing the vote, which 73% of Ukrainians voted for. So again, we rejected the possibility of resolving the crisis. So problems built up, and in 2021, the Russians demanded security guarantees because as the Western countries began to entrench themselves more and more in Ukraine. Now, despite that Washington and NATO said that Russia would invade unless they got security guarantees, we nonetheless decided we couldn't give any guarantees to the Russians. The former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, even argued that success is confrontation, because no compromise can be made with the Russians. Peace happens when Russia can be weakened. This is actually his quote, "Success is confrontation." Now, when the Russians said enough was enough and invaded in February of 2022, on the first day of the invasion, they contacted Zelensky to start negotiations for peace, in demanding that they restore their neutrality. And on day 3, the Ukrainians and Russians had already agreed to start negotiations, and it was possible to get an end to the war and possibly have peace in Europe. This is when the United States and UK intervened by telling Ukraine that they could not support peace negotiations. However, if Ukraine would choose war, then NATO would supply all the weapons they would need. And this is when also the Ukrainians walked away. Now, even now, as we recognize that the war is lost, so we know that restoring Ukraine's neutrality is required in any future peace agreement. The NATO Secretary General nonetheless continues to say over and over again that Ukraine will join NATO immediately once the war is over, effectively making sure that Russia will take essentially as much territory as it can to prevent it from ending up in hands of NATO. So my point is that we already rejected every possible path to peace. So my conclusion is not that Russia is innocent and it has not made any mistakes, but we must also recognize that we instigated this conflict by expanding the military bloc towards Russian borders, and this was a recipe for peace, a hegemonic peace. And since every negotiation has been rejected or sabotaged as it was built on a different format of peace, a peace in which we had to also recognize the security concern of our opponents. Now, I'm not arguing we're evil, but I would say that ideology enables us to sell NATO expansion as a project for peace, or for perpetual peace, as we like to say. But in reality, it revived the Cold War with Russia, and it predictably triggered a war in Ukraine, which has put us on a path to nuclear war. And ideology often prevents us from course correction as well and pursuing peaceful solution. Because we see that dissent is smeared as carrying water for Putin. One is labeled a traitor and frequently intimidated. Now, we all recognize that it's imperative for peace to put ourselves in the shoes of the other side. So I often ask people to do an exercise. Are you able to present or explain the position of Russia to the public in this conflict? Now, what we often see is if you don't even have to agree with it, but just present it. Now, if you're not able to because you don't know what they are, or you know what they are, but you fear the social costs that are imposed of you for daring to explain the Russian position, then it should be obvious to us why also peace has become taboo if we cannot even express the position of our adversaries. Now, armed with ideology, I would argue that the warmongers have hijacked the concept of peace, which is now the destruction of ideological adversaries and the restoration of hegemony. Now, I really hope that the message of JFK, as I said earlier, is spread so we can take back this concept of peace, as this relies on diplomacy, negotiations, mutual understanding, compromise, with the ultimate goal being indivisible security. So again, this is why I really hope that this video of a speech of JFK continues to circulate.
Thank you so much, Professor Diesen.